China, the world's largest communist state, is enthralled to the free market's riches. Its paramount leader preaches the merits of globalization and breaches the limits of one man's rule in a one-party state. A contradiction in flux in a shifting political order. China, the developing country poised to become the world leader. But will the faltering West simply step aside to hand China the reins of power? Or will it tighten its grip? As the big picture previously documented in the China complex, China's path is paved with battle scars from internal struggles and foreign invaders. A vast history of a civilization woven together by a common thread: order. In this episode, we trace China's emergence as a 21st century superpower, lauded and scorned for policies offering prosperity to many and peril to many others. How is China imagining itself or reimagining itself at the center of this world order, because China has the ability, has the capacity to reach throughout the world?
China need to be strong. China need to be a big power. China need to maintain its home, put its home in order. And this is not an aggressive posture to any other country.
Xi Jinping, he's completely changed the whole trajectory. He's decided that China's moment is nigh, that China will now come out and request and requires the rest of the world to pay it due respect.
The Chinese basically will bring to the world, for the humankind, a stark choice. You want to keep the current system, or you want to go back to the China order.
When the students gathered in Tiananmen Square in Beijing and demanded more resolute steps taken by the government against corruption and some of the injustices, eventually not only emotions ran high and ran extreme, but also became very confrontational. What happened in Beijing in the early days of June in 1989 was a big tragedy.
That level of brutal violence, I don't think people were prepared for it. But after it, it's like seeing the real face of a party-state regime. That's the tools of an authoritarian dictator.
An unknown number of people were killed in Tiananmen, and the United States and the West imposed sanctions on China. They're limited sanctions, but no one wanted to visit China anymore.
This was a period when Chinese society and the Chinese government has never come to terms with. It's regarded as a nightmare, I think. It wasn't just the cover-up by the refusal of the government to allow discussion of it. It was that China just moved on in a very decisive way.
The Chinese Communist Party would move on from the Tiananmen Square nightmare. burying the massacre in the ceremonies and monuments marking the 40th anniversary of the People's Republic of China. The protests were written out of history as history was being made. 5 months after the turmoil in Beijing, the Berlin Wall was torn down. The first falling bricks of a crumbling Soviet empire, leaving China as communism's standout standard bearer.
Deng Xiaoping, after 1989, he realized I kind of lost the mandate, right? The whole world is not going to like us, especially the West is not going to like us. So he decided, in order to survive, you better be hiding yourself, be careful, be humble, to wait for your right time, right, to grow, to just make money quietly.
This new approach was taken from classic Confucian thought and called Tao Guang Yang Hui, hide brightness, nourish obscurity. For the Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping, the man who'd spearheaded China's reform era, economic progress had to continue, but away from the limelight. Deng would himself withdraw from the political limelight, quietly guiding his successor, Jiang Zemin, to take China to even greater heights.
The 90s is when Chinese growth exploded, and there was a perception on the part of foreign companies that this really was a huge opportunity. It wasn't just a billion people, but it was a billion people with purchasing power.
All the business people went back in. So if you look at the numbers, that the investments, the FDI, like foreign direct investment and all the flows, all the indicators all get back to normal.
Western business at first recoiled from China in the wake of the Tiananmen Square massacre, but quickly jumped back on the Chinese bandwagon. The Deng-era mantra, "to be rich is glorious," was paying off, and China under Jiang Zemin would reap the rewards.
After 92, Chinese economy really boomed, right? And the government said, all right, as long as you don't challenge my political authority, you can do whatever. So the Chinese ingenuity, very hardworking Chinese people, they really start to make money. Thanks to no small part to have a free access to markets, technology, and so on. So the Chinese further hiding their world order ambition, their China order ambition, saying, oh, we're just an ordinary country, right? If you let me in charge, I'll make you rich.
Living standards improved and poverty reduced at unprecedented levels. Jiang Zemin was fulfilling the mandate from heaven, the ancient creed that validated a leader's authority. He was providing for his people. Made in China became a global calling card. Electronic machinery, textiles, footwear, household goods were exported around the world, growing China's brand and its notion of tianxia, all under heaven, way beyond its 19th century peak. China's expanded reach overseas was also drawing in marginal territories at home. By the early 1990s, minority groups once considered peripheral were now strategically closer to the Han Chinese government's central control.
China is a nation of 56 major ethnic groups, not a monolithic or highly homogeneous nation.
The fundamental challenge is how to sort of maintain stability and order in such a multi-ethnic environment.
China's diverse population had long been held together by a central authority. But for many belonging to ethnic groups, such as the Tibetan Buddhists in China's southwest and Muslim Uyghurs in the western region of Xinjiang, their lands had been forcibly annexed by communist rule, eroding their religious and political freedom, permitting only a shallow, conditional autonomy. During the reform era, as industry spread further west, a directed migration of China's majority Han people transformed the demography, particularly in Xinjiang, as Beijing laid claim to the riches of the land.
The Chinese moved millions of Han people to Xinjiang to migrate there, to Tibet, try to, change the demography there, right? And also the natural resource problem, the division of gains from exploration of natural resources like oil and gas in Xinjiang, for example, is an economic reason for the resentment.
The water from the Tibetan plateau feeds all the major rivers and the tributaries in Asia. China's development needs those resources. They need to extract those natural resources to fuel economic development.
Tibet had seen riots in the late 1980s. Tibetans fought for independence, but their claims were denied. Their protests beaten down by the Chinese state. For the Uyghurs, state repression added fuel to a separatist movement that for decades sought to reclaim Xinjiang as a Muslim-majority state, so-called East Turkestan.
After the reform started in the 80s and 90s, the Chinese government and also forced cultural assimilation. In the 90s, the Uyghurs started to take things in their own hands, especially the radical elements of it. And they hooked up with the old notion of East Turkmenistan.
The separatist movements were running amok, and they decided to maximize their impact by bombing public facilities, transportation, for example, indiscriminately killing people of different nationalities. You would actually expect to see deterioration and escalation if such events are not controlled properly.
Beijing took an uncompromising line on those agitating to split from China. The Chinese Communist Party's Strike Hard campaign in 1996 stamped down on any calls for independence, violent or peaceful. Uyghur, as well as Tibetan separatists, were shown little mercy. The legalist doctrine, used throughout China's history to keep a strict order, was again the first resort of authoritarian rule. We see in the 1990s the Strike Hard campaigns.
Right.
What were the Strike Hard campaigns about? What were the goal of these campaigns?
The Strike Hard campaign actually is kind of a routine apply of extra legal punishment of people who allegedly committed a crime. That is a method that was employed by Mao Zedong in a different name. And Deng Xiaoping sort of reinstituted that as early as 1983 to deal with the hooligans, the destabilizing element of society in a harsh way, periodically.
Could it then be argued that this Strike Hard campaign, this effort, whether brute force or not, to maintain stability is what allowed China to prosper economically? I mean, at the same time, undeniably, we saw this huge economic growth. Victor, what do you remember from that period?
I would say the Chinese government, ever since 1978, is very much driven by maintaining stability, mostly political stability, at all cost. I personally don't think strike harsh is one of the most impressive things in our memory. I think it was the rapid economic reform and much more opening to the outside world in the 1990s that really stood out.
We are dealing with a fallacy here. The fallacy is that if the party state had not devoted so much resources to maintain stability, China's economic growth would not have happened or would not have happened quite so fast or quite spectacularly.
The cost issue, and that is to maintain stability at all cost. What do you mean by all cost and whose stability? You don't have to kill people all the way to get there.
It's easier said than the reality. The Chinese economic transformation is a miracle in itself. There must be internal reasons which can explain the profound transformation. No single other country can do
That's
that.
not true. Factually wrong. Factually wrong.
No single
the Chinese
country can
economy grew faster in 1910s, 1920s, and to 1930s, faster than PRC ever achieved. You go check numbers.
First of all, I don't think professors or many other people in the world know the real secret behind the Chinese development.
What is that?
Therefore,
What is the secret?
probably they do not know what exactly is driving China's profound transformation. Now, whether people in other countries like it or not, we don't care. Maintaining stability at all cost and keeping peace will remain the pillars upon which China's transformation will continue to be.
China working to maintain world peace. What has China done?
His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales.
The strained peace that China had kept with Britain for a century and a half was about to see the tying up of an historic loose end.
5 hours from now, the Union flag will be lowered and the flag of China will fly over Hong Kong.
In the villages closest to the Chinese border is a Hong Kong a world away from the money-making frenzy of the city. Here, the flags of the mainland fly in celebration of the imminent return to China.
Hong Kong has always been part of China, so it's always nice to go back to the motherland.
But a different view was being expressed in the very heart of Hong Kong's tourist and business centre.
We are basically very skeptical, and we are very worried about losing any or all of our freedoms.
On their first day in charge, this is the first test of the new regime's promises of tolerance.
The British did not give the Hong Kong people a right to rule them for themselves. Very limited, in other words. Hong Kong local elites only participate in the governance of the economy in a limited fashion, right? So it's not democracy, but Hong Kong was free.
Let's be absolutely clear about the British legacy. There was the rule of law, which was very important, but there was no democracy. There were no elections to the LegCo of any kind until about 10 years before the handover to China.
In 1997, Britain's 99-year lease on Hong Kong expired. The colony it had secured as one of the spoils of the Opium Wars was reluctantly returned to China. Beijing would implement a policy of one country, two systems in Hong Kong, leaving its model of making money untouched, and for a period of 50 years, granting its people a degree of self-governance and civic rights denied to those on the mainland, at least for the next half-century.
There would be a guarantee for 50 years of Hong Kong people's way of life, our core values. So these were supposed to be protected, and Hong Kong would move towards something called genuine, autonomy.
Democracy was implied, not really promised.
In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization, the body responsible for regulating global free trade. A year later, a new leader, Hu Jintao, would take charge of the Chinese Communist Party, taking office with echoes of Deng Xiaoping's appeal to hide brightness and nourish obscurity, to keep China's quickening rise from being seen as a gathering threat.
There were rising worries about China's growing power. So I think some of Hu Jintao's advisors, policy advisors, they studied the rise and fall of great powers. They learned some lessons. So they realized the rise of new great powers might generate instability in the international system, maybe even conflict. So they try to figure out how to avoid that kind of confrontation with the established power.
China begins to usurp the place of the United States and Japan as a trading nation and becomes the major trading partner of all of the countries in this region.
That was the context how Hu Jintao and his advisors proposed the idea of peaceful rise. But later on, they realized even peaceful rise was a little bit threatening, because if you rise, others must decline, right? So then they further changed the slogan from peaceful rise to peaceful development, because development looks more benign.
China was rising. Under Hu Jintao, China consolidated links with Africa, Latin America, and across Asia, hosting world leaders, as well as visiting strategic partners abroad. Past disputes with the likes of Russia, Japan, and India were smoothed over, not quite resolved, but no longer allowed to get in the way of harmonious trade relations. Hu also called for a harmonious society at home, pushing a Confucian ideal of social harmony to tackle inequality that was hard to tell apart from increased censorship and surveillance as dissent was harmonized. In the summer of 2008, China showcased the veneer of a harmonious nation developing peacefully at the Olympic Games in Beijing. Western powers, deaf to protests by rights activists, gorged themselves on the splendor and spectacle of China's Olympic extravaganza, just as Western business was profiting from China's boom. But by the end of 2008, a financial crisis that began in the United States brought the West's financial markets to the brink of collapse. One country would step forward as the economic savior.
The Chinese were buying larger and larger quantities of U.S. Treasury bonds. Eventually went over $1 trillion worth of bonds, trying to prevent the bond from falling out of global markets and turning a deep recession into a global depression.
The global financial crisis destroyed the prestige of the United States and the Western European countries in terms of their mastery of modern capitalist economics, and created a universal impression that the United States and Europe were both declining.
China realized it might be more important than vast majority of Chinese people realize. There were rapid rising expectations. China should play a leadership role. China should play a much more important role in global affairs.
The Americans, instead of just looking at China as a rising major country, began to see it as a rising strategic threat.
With their rise comes increased responsibilities that come with being a world power. Their progress and their development over the last century.
US President Barack Obama would enter the White House and refocus American foreign policy away from the Middle East and toward Asia.
Thank you.
The Obama administration would court leaders from across the region. However, the US pivot to Asia was seen by many as a reaction to China's growing influence, challenging its claims of peaceful development. Just as America grasped the idea of China as a rival power, a new figure would emerge who'd take on the mandate of heaven and take up the mantle of paramount leader.
you get the election of Xi Jinping as the new General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. And this is the most important shift since Deng Xiaoping in 1978.
Curiously, he was seen by the West as a more liberal figure than his counterparts.
Xi Jinping came in with new slogans, the China dream, the Chinese dream. However, it's not necessarily the dream of Chinese people.
It was meant to mean many things, some explicit, some implicit, that the Chinese people now, are attaining a level of prosperity they could only have ever dreamt of, and that China could be expansive, once more being an influential political, cultural, ideological, military power in the world. In other words, China's arrived.
In 2013, President Xi Jinping arrived with a vision for China far removed from the strategic modesty of his predecessors. He would stake his claim on power and on the support of the people by taking on a scourge that had long corroded China's political system.
So Xi Jinping introduces this anti-corruption drive. Tigers and flies. In other words, the big and the small.
The first and most important part is in fact a party ratification campaign to get rid of the corrupt and ineffective and disloyal so that the party will be loyal to him. Secondly, Xi Jinping became a genuinely popular leader in China because he was seen as a leader seriously for the first time in the post-Deng period, taking on corruption and putting these corrupt officials in jail.
Sometimes he sounds like a Mao, because these kind of discipline issue really came from that period.
Comparisons with the founder of the People's Republic of China, Mao Zedong, played into Xi Jinping's projected authority as he looked to project China's authority far beyond its own borders.
中国将出资400亿美元成立丝路基金，为“一带一路”沿线国家的基础设施、资源开发、产业合作和金融合作等。
The Belt and Road Initiative started up as a Eurasian infrastructure and connectivity project. And eventually it spilled over into Northern Africa, or eventually it spilled over into the totality of the African continent.
What do you do with all that know-how, all that capacity? Well, you offer it, or you find the rest of the world that needs it and make the contribution that way. And in return, they buy Chinese goods, or however they decide to pay for it.
It's intimidation. It's political intimidation, economic intimidation. I think people are saying, gee, that's not really a win-win deal after all. The only one that's win-winning is China, because now we're just debtors. Now they own everything. Now they own the port. Now they own the airport. Now they own the harbor port.
One of the purposes was to enable China to strengthen its relationship with a whole bunch of countries outside of the immediate orbit of the United States and Europe.
This is the first time we have a non-Western power that's economically and politically in a position to matter.
For decades, America has lost our jobs and our factories to unfair foreign trade.
But with the arrival of a new president in the White House,
other countries have made a living taking advantage of the United States in so many ways, as you know.
Communist China's climb to the top of the free trade tree would be challenged by a man who saw free trade as fair game. 2018, US President Donald Trump imposed trade tariffs in an attempt to reduce America's trade deficit with China, as well as to punish the Chinese for alleged theft of US intellectual property. Beijing retaliated with tariffs of its own. In a standoff with the world's most powerful nation, the president of China was standing his ground.
China needs to have a strong leader, and we need stability at all costs. We cannot afford a situation where the party, the government, the regime, the country, the culture, the civilization will be integrated.
I totally disagree with the message you're sending, because today China is not in any dire crisis as a nation. The regime, however, is still in the internal paranoia for security. That's where the problem is, because the regime lost its legitimacy after all those decades, and now is basically by buying favors from people. I'll let you make money. And by pretending, I'm not doing any trouble outside, but I'm going to build my muscles, because only muscles, only power gives this kind of government the confidence.
What has happened with Xi Jinping is that he's decided the Deng Xiaoping principle of hiding and biting is over, that China's moment is nigh, that China will now come out and request and requires the rest of the world to pay it due respect. It is that very assertive approach that Xi Jinping has taken, which is causing all kinds of changes in China's relationship with the rest of the world.
We have a certain leader in the US right now. We have President Donald Trump, and he is certainly perceiving it as a threat to the US to the extent that it actually is President Trump who started this trade war.
The issue with the trade war is the transformation that happened in the last 40 years. Previously, the United States was very comfortable giving massive amount of investment and help for China to develop, not entirely altruistically. They were hoping that China would be more like the US. That didn't happen, and China, at the early stage of development, was so much behind the Americans that they were completely relaxed about, yes, the Chinese are stealing our intellectual property rights and all that, but we are so much ahead of them. They are now no longer comfortable because they see China now as a strategic competitor, pushing for, under President Xi Jinping, a world that is safe for authoritarianism.
I would modify that on that note. That is, it's not even a problem between US and China. It's a problem between US and the PRC government. Unfortunately, the government in China, through various ways, are doing things that seem to be threatening to what the United States is believing in. And that's where the bipartisan support
By doing things that are
emerges.
threatening, do you mean that China seems to be poised or positioning itself
As
to
an
go
alternative.
forward as a superpower?
As an alternative to American leadership, to the current world order. And that's where the threat is.
Let me add a few points. No, first of all, the United States seems to be increasingly losing its sanity about the specter of China gaining size, gaining weight, gaining more impact, etc. I think the professor talked about ideological differences or human rights or democracy. No, these are not the most important thing between China and the United States. The most important driving force for increasing US insanity is because China is gaining weight and becoming larger and larger as a force in the world.
An emboldened Xi Jinping abolished presidential term limits, freeing him to rule for years to come. But while China's president was decreeing more freedom for himself, he was cutting back the freedoms of the Chinese people. Journalists, rights activists, online bloggers were all subjected to increased state censorship and control, familiar tools of repression for China's minority groups.
What is happening in Xinjiang is now becoming a CCP's war, not just against terrorism or against separatists or local autonomy people, but against religion as well. So for the people outside of China, we look in, we think it looks like the CCP is launching an anti-Islam war, which may not be the case.
Sporadic outbreaks of violence between ethnic Han and Uyghurs in Xinjiang, as well as attacks on civilian targets by a small minority of Uyghur separatists, had led to an unprecedented crackdown by the Chinese state against the majority Muslim people of the region. Years of brutally imposed order on the Uyghurs now took the form of forced assimilation through what Beijing called free vocational training camps. China was seemingly putting down the ambition of a separate nation by beating out the markers of a separate identity.
It is absolutely true that there are violent, terribly violent incidents of Uyghurs attacking Han Chinese. That is not a legitimate rationale for the authorities to then now pass legislation anti-extremists, saying you're an extremist. Why are you an extremist? You have a beard. You're fasting. You're praying. You're speaking the language. Those have now become signs of extremism.
One of the things the Chinese government has been doing in Xinjiang is re-education camp. This is very much play into the philosophy of a Weiwen, maintaining stability, in the sense they want to have a preemptive effort, right? To stop the trouble before trouble even starts.
The demands of some Uyghurs for an independent state, along with the wider adherence to Islam and the Turkic culture, whose roots were seen as quite distinct from those of China's Han majority, were trouble for Beijing. Leaked documents in 2019 showed a state-sanctioned program of mass incarceration of ethnic religious minorities, mostly Uyghurs, adding to the claims of brainwashing, torture, and sexual abuse. First-hand accounts spoke of brutal Sinicization. Those deemed too different were being branded with the Han Chinese standard. The Chinese Communist Party denied all accusations.
If you are talking about 2 million people jailed or incarcerated, and some Western reports even call them concentration camps, on a par with the Nazi Germany's concentration camps, I think this is really motivated with other ulterior motives. I think the Chinese government is doing the right thing to make sure that stability is under control.
Stability called for a crackdown on the symbols and insignia of Islamic tradition, from public displays of Arabic text to the banning of beards and even Muslim names. Reports of physical and sexual violence, as well as automated police surveillance and facial recognition technology to monitor Uyghur activity, had brought a harsh new reality for the people of Xinjiang.
Xinjiang was then gradually being transformed into a kind of a police state. And Xi Jinping's approach to it is to, well, make them good, proper Chinese. It's absolutely all right for them to be Uyghurs if they simply eat pork and drink alcohol, and preferably even smoke cigarettes like good Han Chinese citizens always do.
But not all Han Chinese have been prepared to be the good citizens decreed by Beijing.
What is happening in Hong Kong ever since the Umbrella campaign is that the Hong Kong people believe, especially the young people, students, believe their freedoms are undermined, eroded.
The one country, two systems policy had remained an uneasy compromise since Hong Kong's return to China in 1997. In 2014, mass sit-in protests against the lack of democratic process caused widespread disruption, before firm police action and legal intervention brought the so-called Umbrella Revolution to an unproductive end. But the discontent remained. In the summer of 2019, as the Hong Kong Executive Council tried to introduce a controversial new extradition law, that discontent, once again, took to the streets, en masse. The extradition law was abandoned, but the protests continued.
They sent in police and escalated the use of violence. And that transformed the whole dynamics in Hong Kong from a very specific protest and specific demand to become something much, much bigger. Then it becomes a matter of the credibility of the government, it becomes a matter of democracy in Hong Kong.
Violence spread through the protests. protesters and police painted as perpetrators and victims by supporters and critics. Beijing watched on, blaming the violence on criminals and lawless rioters, as well as foreign powers keen to put China in its long-gone, but not long-forgotten place.
What's behind the whole history, let's say, of China from 49 is that legacy of real humiliation, military, economic, political, where they lost land and ceded land. That's why Hong Kong's so important. It comes from this sense that never again, we will never be humiliated again.
November 2019. The center of Hong Kong turned into a battlefield. Students barricaded inside a polytechnic building. Riot police with live ammunition moving to clear them out. Tension and tear gas fill the air. The spectacle of a war zone with the specter of tanks looming in the minds of those old enough to remember the massacre at Tiananmen Square. Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party remember.
If they allow this to continue, in their view, they're going to look like they lost to 2 million Hong Kong people. That we went out on the street and they had to back down. In the minds of an authoritarian dictator, the last thing you do is back down and let the people win.
They care a lot about faith. They care a lot about the message. They have mixed messages. One is to keep Hong Kong's one country system work. The other thing is I don't want to send the wrong message to my own people because my control cannot be challenged.
If certain people want to launch a revolution in Hong Kong, it will not be accepted, and it will not be tolerated, and it will be dealt with as rebellion.
Beijing is stuck. If they let it happen, they've lost. If they bring out the troops, they've lost. What they're facing is a lose-lose scenario.
Later in November, district council elections saw the people of Hong Kong turn out in unprecedented numbers and vote overwhelmingly against pro-Beijing candidates. 17 of the 18 local councils would now be controlled by councillors calling for greater democratic reform, echoing at the ballot box what protesters had, sometimes peacefully, sometimes violently, called for on the streets.
With this government, there has been a big push to unite China under one identity, at least. This push to remind people that you are Chinese. I think that's happening both in Xinjiang and it's happening in Hong Kong as well. What is behind that push?
Basically, two things emerged. One is the very strong inner logic, deeply rooted in the Qinghan polity that mandates the top leader to control everything as much as possible, as broadly as possible, in Xinjiang or in Hong Kong. The second point is, arguably, is a total failure of the CCP government to manage minority regions or manage SAR in Hong Kong. That is, after all those years, things do not improve. They get worse and worse, right?
Well, I think there's something much more contemporary in explaining it. It's in the very nature of the political system. And the Communist Party has a mission, which is to unite all Chinese bits back into Mother China. And therefore, it is essential for the Communist Party to get people in Hong Kong to fall in line and behave like people on the mainland of China. That's what they are doing in Xinjiang. They are trying to synthesize the Uyghur people to make them into good Han Chinese citizens.
No, I would say it is an insult to the Uyghur people and the Uyghur country to believe that you can synthesize the Uyghurs. No,
that's what they're doing.
Listen, the Uyghurs are the very proud Muslim people, the brothers and sisters of ours, and you can never change their cultural heritage. You can never change their spiritual faith. And China will be richer and better if we continue to have such diversity. Therefore, I think mislabeling the situation in China in general, mislabeling the situation in Xinjiang is not only wrong, but also very dangerous.
Now, we know about the American dream. We've known about this for a while. But Xi Jinping has introduced this Chinese dream, which he wants all the communities, including those in Xinjiang, to come under. In your opinion, Victor, what is that about, if that's not about Sinization?
I would say the Chinese dream thinks about each and every Chinese citizen, for example, having a better living standard, having a better car, having a better house.
And can they think about ideas like universalism, about human rights, about civil society, about constitutionalism?
Professor.
Would that not be part of their better life?
Professor.
They are not allowed to learn those words. They are not allowed to say those words.
Professor, if anyone believes that the Chinese do not care about human rights, that's not only deadly wrong, that's very misleading.
We are engaging,
So
engaging a rather typical talk about half-truth. Look at the Chinese official definition of what is Chinese dream. The strong country, strong military, tranquil society, and rights for the people. That's the kind of ranking order.
Of course.
So that's why it's called, you're talking about half-truth here.
Of course we need to have a strong China. And in order to have a strong China, we need to have a strong military.
It's like you put in the carriage before the house,
with
before the horse.
a strong China and with a strong military, each of the Chinese can be a better person. This is the logic for China, and I don't think,
that assumption has never been proven. When you have a doctrine of stability at all costs, what are those costs? Human rights are clearly among those costs.
Professor.
So that's where the problem is.
And compare China today with China 10 years ago. 10 years ago, there were human rights lawyers. There were people who were working for human rights, defending human rights in China. They don't exist in China today.
Professor,
10 years ago, there's also a term limit of
Professor, for the record, the Chinese people as a whole are prouder nation today than 10 years ago.
How do you know?
Well,
have you sampled 1.4 billion Chinese?
Today, China is led by a man empowered by his country's history. For Xi Jinping, comparisons to Mao Zedong flatter as well as deceive. He quotes the words of ancient scholars to signal the virtues of legalism, a nod to China's authoritarian roots. And all the while, he promotes Confucius as a national brand across the world.
The whole idea of Xi Jinping is grounded on this sense of power, success, prosperity. I own the mandate of heaven. I will take the country forward, China triumphant in the globe.
An emperor needs to have a legitimate mandate to rule, and anyone has the right to challenge the legitimacy of the emperor if people believe he no longer has the mandate to rule.